I'd just like to introduce Cameron Tonkinwise, who's currently the Professor of Design at UNSW Art and Design, and he was previously Director of Doctoral Studies at Carnegie Mellon University's School of Design and co-chair of the Tishman Environment and Design Centre at the New School. Cameron has been researching and teaching design for sustainability for more than 2 decades, with a focus on systems of shared use. He is currently working on the development of a new practice of transition design that is design-led structural change towards more sustainable futures. Cameron will present key components of transition design and compare them to other forms of design for social innovation.
Thanks, Jax. Thank you. I am losing my voice, which is unfortunate. So sorry about that, but nevertheless, I'll still try and yell at you for a little while.
Do you want a mic?
No, I'm happy yelling. It's my natural ecosystem, I think. So first of all, just 2 sort of thoughts on what we've been hearing so far. What I'm going to try and talk to you about, on the one hand, can be read, I think, as something between what Jax was indicating to you, the kind of being in the weeds of doing social change, and just how difficult that is on you as individuals, how difficult that is on you as small firm practitioners, for example, what it actually means to be involved in community work. So that kind of very thick situation where you're struggling to find agency. I think there's those kind of situations, and then on the other, Sue's given us a fantastic example of thinking very large structural change, so large that is in fact planetary, and wondering, and a whole series of different kinds of ideas like the circular economy or shared value, sort of large abstract ideas which universities have come up with generally, which are from research looking like extraordinarily good ways in which we could move to more sustainable futures. But I think the gap between those two is something that we all feel all the time. And we live in a perpetual state of guilt. All of you, we all feel like we are constantly not doing enough between this kind of in-the-weeds work and what it is that we actually need to be doing, the actual scale of the change. It's not helped when some idiot like Trump gets in. So I think on the one hand, I'm going to try and talk to you about ways in which we've been thinking about something in between those two and trying to understand how one could link that kind of everyday practice with these kind of scale of change, Anthropocenic levels of change. The second kind of introduction I'll just make is that I understand that a lot of people coming to the Social Design Sydney talks are practitioners, but nevertheless you're coming to a university, you're coming to a very novel kind of university situation in terms of this Design Innovation Research Centre, and you're hearing this evening a lot of academics. Oliver is the only one who can claim that he is not an academic, which puts him way above us in that regard. And so I think it's just important to kind of think about the role of universities in the general ecosystem of our society. They're an incredible privilege. Those of us who get to work at them have an incredibly privileged situation. Everything I'm about to talk to you about, I developed in the last 5 years with my colleagues Terry Irwin and Gideon Kossoff at Carnegie Mellon University, and it was an amazing situation of privilege. We were a tiny school in a wealthy university in a city that has enormous issues in terms of African American population and lead in the water. And so, but we had this opportunity to kind of think about these sorts of things and try to take stock on where design education is and where the level of change that we need was as well. So I think it's important as practitioners to wonder about the role of a university. Universities in this country are these large lumbering masses that are desperately neoliberalising themselves. As Sue kind of indicated, we're all chasing as much money as you're chasing. And so it becomes this terrible situation of saying, how can the actual privilege and value of a university be preserved for the scale of change we now need to make, given that we are in different situations and yet somehow just the same, chasing this kind of money? So I just wanted to kind of mention that as a context for this evening's talk, because these are particularly academic style talks for this kind of audience. And I did sort of just want to raise that question. I don't have so much answers. The way I'll talk about transition design doesn't give that kind of answer. But just what exactly can that relationship be between the privilege of a university and the space of praxis that is being a frontline sustainable social designer, for example? The last introduction is to say I'm going to talk a lot about design. I'm presuming that a lot of people here have gone to some kind of design school? Yes. How many people have gone to a design school? Right, the rest of those people are the invaders coming doing design thinking. Boo. So I'm going to talk to you about design. No, I'm kidding, obviously, because I'm that same interloper. One of the things I want to talk to you about is sort of how important that role of design education itself is. So the one kind of way to indicate this is, imagine if 30 years ago, Abby Malik and I were consulting on Engineers Australia kind of curriculum. And I would always imagine if we'd managed to actually get something like the Anthropocene into engineers education 30 years ago. And imagine the infrastructure in Sydney right now. Desalination plants, WestConnex, light rail. Imagine if you actually had those people having been educated in that kind of context. So it's very interesting to think about these large-scale changes and just how we educate. And then it's interesting to think about your own education as a designer. So I am someone who comes from a philosophic background. I'm someone who obviously believes that design is everything. Everything with those two words run together. It is everything has been designed. Every chair, every piece of clothing has been designed. You know all this. But what you perhaps sometimes forget as you focus on your particular types of design is that you are mediating everything else. Every time we have an idea, which might be like really metaphysical, or every time we have an infrastructure, the only way in which those things arrive is by being mediated by designers. So we're responsible for everything, which makes it particularly important when you start talking about something like the Anthropocene. We are the people who constitute the artificial. We are the pinch point between what it is, these kind of ideas that people have, and how we experience the world. Now, every other discipline does not recognise the value of design. And I think you would all know this from whenever you're talking to your business managers, or wherever you're having to deal with an engineer or a technician or a coder. You know to some extent that everybody kind of misses that amazing pervasiveness of the power of design and its agency. And so I'm telling you this because transition design tries to capture again this kind of sense of agency. The fact that people miss it because it is just simply functioning, they don't notice it until it breaks down. And the fact that as a result it becomes this crucial stepping stone to other types of futures. That when Sydney was having, for example, trouble with its water, when it was sitting in a 10-year drought, you might have a whole series of local utilities telling you to have shorter showers. You can't have a shorter shower until you bring time into the shower. So we have these disgusting objects which somebody probably didn't design very well. But nevertheless, this is the only way to actually have a shorter shower. Otherwise, you've got no idea. You just get out and you think, damn, that was another long shower. Right? Particularly if you've got long hair. I understand it's much harder for the people with long, curly hair. So you understand that design is the mediator of these kinds of futures. That it takes somebody apparently like this to imagine that we can actually put our fingers on things that aren't buttons. And that will open up an entirely new practice. As a result of somebody making this kind of decision, we will soon hold televisions in our hand. If you said that to someone 12 years ago, they would have said you were ridiculous. So design is the thing that enables these kind of futures. You can completely change the geography of New York City, for example, by having an app and a bike sharing system. So design has this incredible power, but always within very constrained kind of customer relations or whoever is sponsoring the design project. Design, of course, used to have these ambitions. Designers used to be the sort of people who thought we are about saving or at least changing the world. This was the modernist dream, which was the very birth of the design practices that most of you were educated in. Unfortunately, these days, all that's left of that large modernist ambition, as I said to you before, is something like guilt. Is something like feeling you're not doing enough, and so you yell very annoyingly about anybody who tells you to change the world. You say you're just being pathetic. It's a type of therapy. You're totally sort of failing to understand that we are so constrained. All we can ever possibly do is come up with a minimum viable product. It's as much agency as we have. So transition design kind of tries to speak to this particular ambition. It is something that's trying to say that designers have not generally had adequate educations for their anthropocenic capacities, for their anthropocenic affects or effects, for what it is they're actually doing to the planet. And if you look, I'll run through this very quickly, but if you look at the design education, it was essentially craft, plus a bit of consumer psychology for a while, plus a little bit of manufacturability. This is kind of as much theory as designers ever used to get. At some certain point, we all got very enamoured of semiotics, and we were forced to take a little cultural studies subjects. Finally, we really started re-instrumentalising and focusing on users. So we reduced the human just to this simple kind of idea. This is how designers actually think about the human. And then finally, as Liz Sanders herself is going to come and teach us, well, we supplement that at least with some participation. So I've done a very crude job here of just saying, if this is as sophisticated as the history of 20th century European design, by the way, only, but if this is as sophisticated as 20th century design is, no wonder we are in the mess we are. Designers have not been adequately educated. I think particularly problematic these days is the little kind of history they used to get has now been completely dumped, and in most schools, designers are actually just being told to go and do social design projects as their way of getting sort of politicised or learning cultural theory, which is this terrible idea that you take student designers, you give them a student project, you send them out, you tell them it's really fine to fail early, fail often, except for the community who they're supposed to serve. Don't worry about them, they're in a bad position already. Did you learn something? That's called culture, that's called cultural difference. Go now, practice. Right? So I think it's particularly problematic. I think it's problematic that design education remains primarily studio-based in a kind of apprentice model, that our history has just been replaced by this kind of social experience of social kind of social design experiences, and primarily to do with transition design, that designers do not get educated in any substantial accounts of social or technological change. So we started thinking about how we could begin to do something about this. And one of the first insights we had is that really in the last, let's say, 30 years, that universities have actually taken design schools in. Because you must remember it's a very recent discipline. They were mostly designers learn in standalone art and design colleges, and then we started moving to universities. In that 30 years, which design education has not really developed much, a lot of learning was occurring, as most of you would know if you've been coming to these talks, a lot of learning has been occurring about how change happens. There have been a lot of people working in the space between the social and the ecological, understanding these kinds of evolutionary models of change. There have been a lot of people looking at technological change, large regime shifts, and there have been a whole lot of people looking at social practices. And so we thought we need to start to teach designers about these. And so we came up with this kind of model. This is not a model that you do. This is more like a map of a series of fields that we think need to be brought together. So this is not something you can just take and start practicing. Transition design doesn't kind of exist as a practice. It's a series of interrelated knowledges that we're trying to think through at the moment and that we're trying to teach designers about. We think designers don't know enough about these sorts of things. I'm going to start here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the top three. I'm not actually going to talk about the bottom one much at all. To some extent, Jack's covered that with that nice summary in relation to the social innovation event in New Zealand. The first thing is just to also say that in the 30 years that universities have finally incorporated design education, design itself has changed. And yet, I think I know from having talked to some of the service designers in the room, it's very difficult to actually get good graduates to go and work at your firms because they are inadequately equipped for these new types of design. I've also been a little surprised about that in Australia as well, coming from the US where it's a lot more connected to kind of industry. So these are the kinds of things that have been happening in design that we are trying to draw on in transition design that I think design schools, particularly in Australia, are not doing adequately. I think an understanding of the very difference that digital platforms make to design, the fact that they are much more complex and adaptive spaces than dealing with physical products. I think this is very important. It's a very important thing that designers need to know when they're working with change models. I think it's also very important for social innovation people to know it. They often don't understand that sufficiently, in my experience. In each of these, I'm going to say what we're trying to take from these kind of experiences, but also the kind of things that we're pretty worried about. I am very worried about the acceleration of design processes, precisely because they seem to take away any capacity to do future visioning. I think service design itself is a very important resource for transition design, understanding processes of co-creation, understanding that the nature of work is changing. I'm very worried when service design just plays into very 20th century models of civility, or when it moves into very 21st century models of exploitation, i.e. Uber. I think the sharing economy, as Sue was indicating, provides a very interesting kind of model, a very interesting new understanding of value. If you're going to talk about value co-creation, you really have to start thinking about sharing economies. Again, I think it's very interesting to see the way in which economies are being re-embedded in social, rather than having been alienated from them as they were over the last 150 years. So I think these are interesting potentials, but obviously there's a lot of missteps going on, particularly when interaction designers think they can do sharing economy. And lastly, just also because we're here at UTS, I think it's very important to recognise that this is one of the most significant new developments in relation to doing social change. I was extraordinarily excited to see it when Case's book first came out. The only comparison I would make with transition design is trying to move away from merely problem framing to starting to think about longer time frames. So these are the kinds of, 5 minutes, these are the kinds of ways of designing that we think design schools aren't adequately dealing with, and we would like to start educating designers in these fields, not so that they can go and work for Meld, but so that they can start to actually do transition design. They might also be able to work for Meld, but that's not my primary objective just at the moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the visioning thing. I'm going to talk very quickly and just say it's amazing how bankrupt our society is about imagining alternative futures. The only version of alternative futures we have are photo collages made by architects and urban planners. Enough said, right? They have no substance, they're undesirable, and they're just not actually doing the work. So I think one of the things we need to do desperately is recover a sense of alternative futures. We need to recover a kind of futures literacy. We need to have designers who think a lot more. It's amazing how many times you can go to a design school and ask, do you actually teach anything to do with futures, future studies, even scenario planning, very conventional business versions? Do you teach even forecasting? Fashion schools maybe have a trend forecasting, but no other design schools ever seem to teach any substantial version of futures, even though it's a very substantial discipline in its own right. So I think designers should be understanding all this. They should come up with more credible futures. They should be thinking about stretching versions of what is the possible and the plausible. I think there are some risks, obviously, when one does this kind of futuring. Designers have a very bad history of doing what I would call Procrustianism. Those of you who know your Greek mythology know that he's the person who chopped people's bodies up to fit the box that he made. He only made, it was like standardised product, you only make one coffin. If you don't fit in the coffin, we just chop you up to fit the coffin. And I think a lot of visions don't have any kind of adaptability or any sense of agility, even though I'm a bit worried about agile as a framework. I nevertheless think that future designers need to be able to think in terms of creating desirable futures that are also modifiable. So the way we talk about this in relation to transition design is second-order futures or feeling round corners. So just to quickly kind of give you an illustration, whenever anyone shows you the cone of futures, you've all seen the cone of futures before. Dunn and Raby. So whenever people show this, they never actually indicate that in fact the problem is this very linear Western version of left to right, present, future, as kind of destined. I think it's always useful to use this terrible illustration because it indicates that there are futures over there, and futures over there, and futures over there. And it indicates that if I march towards this future over here, I can actually see one I couldn't see before. There's some people behind the pole I couldn't see. Right, so I think it's you start to get a sense of second-order future or feeling around corners. Very quickly, here's another kind of illustration. I had a big argument with Terry Irwin about this for a long time. So let's say I wanted to get to the moon. You can't aim straight for the moon. This diagram's a bit stupid because you actually have to go all the way around the Earth to get to the moon. But let's say I'm trying to get to the moon. You can't get there. So then you kind of backcast and you recognise I'm going to have to actually aim for here. In order to get to the moon, this is my first step. I don't go directly. I take a sideward step slightly. But the whole point is once you get here, you can actually see a very different kind of future. You can see other kind of possibilities. So this is this kind of agility. It's not doing futuring. It's not giving up futuring and just MVPing and following the market. It's precisely about futuring and taking steps in order to create platforms that enable other kinds of futures. Okay, so we do a lot of this kind of work in terms of backcasting. You might ask also about the content. The content, I think, just goes back to Sue's talk, that the content of the kind of futures that we're promoting with this kind of model are cosmopolitanly local, or as Etienne Manzini calls them, slow, local, open and connected. I think you're going to hold a workshop in a couple of weeks to do with theories of change. So we've made this a kind of section in the model because we think there are lots of theories of change that designers should understand and know about. This does actually fit with a lot of kind of models to do with agile around hypothesis formulation. And obviously those of you in the social innovation space know that this is now almost the cliche discourse. Do not make a move unless you have a theory of change. It's very interesting that designers don't really think that way yet. And I think there are more interesting theories of change when you act as a designer and understand something about the socio-material than a lot of social innovation people normally when they do this kind of work. I think designers have access to those pinch points, those interfaces that I talked about at the very beginning. So we try to draw on lots of different types of social theories of social change when we try to introduce transition design to people. I'm not going to explain any of these. I'm just going to say that at the moment we're doing a lot of work in this particular territory and where this fits with this. This one tends to look like horrible diagrams like this. This is the theory of change. An idea that there are landscapes and infrastructures which are slow moving, the idea that you have to kind of fracture practices in order to create new types of futures. And you do that by experimenting. Sometimes they look like this. And then the last, I said I'd only talk about this very briefly, but I hope what I've kind of indicated is despite the fact that these are large-scale academic discourses that we are trying to marshal and put in the hand of designers, there is a recognition in the model that this has to, in the end, be practiced by somebody. And that this practice is going to be particularly difficult. And it's going to be a whole new disposition for designers, because designers are very used to, when they work in the product realm in particular, designing for something over there. It used to be primarily men designing domestic appliances for women, for example, 1950. These days, it still has that situation in that somebody else, a client, comes through and I am a designer, but now a bank has walked in and they're asking for a website or a service journey. And I am designing it for them. It's not actually my problem. I'm not actually going to suffer the consequences of my own design. So I can be like an architect who never has to live in the house that I built. I think when you start understanding that we are talking about systems thinking and you're talking about large-scale structural change, then you have to recognise that you are part of the systems that you are trying to change. And that requires a very different kind of disposition, one in which you recognise your own finitude, the limits of what you can do, and you take responsibility despite that. You don't excuse it like the guilt that I began with, but instead you actually start taking heed of moving in stages, multi-stage, multi-level. Or to harken back to the good old Greeks, I would call this phronesis. So finally, these are the sorts of things that I think, just to complete the circle, these are the sorts of things that we're encouraging designers to do. We're encouraging them to be much better at systems mapping, though in a place like this you'll see a lot of that work already occurring. It's just that it doesn't get taught very well to designers at design schools. We're encouraging a lot more sense of futuring and backcasting, as I said, multi-stage and ongoing work, not just what I call serial monogamism, which is when a designer does one job and then says thank you, and then moves on to another job and says thank you, and then moves on to another job. They get bored very easily. This is about designers who stick with things over a long stage. And just harkening back to the previous Social Design Sydney talk, we also do a lot of work thinking about living labs as spaces of experiments in which people try out new practices, new infrastructures, new ways of living. So that's transition design. There's lots of written about it. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Goodbye.